Update, my plan is now 14 pages long. This is why it took so long for me to start filming this, because I kept having more and more ideas. So if you watched my last video, you know that I talked kind of about what is fast fashion, how do we define it, and what is its history. In other words, how did we get to where we are now with fashion? I briefly covered some of the brands that are involved. Definitely didn't even scratch the surface. There's not an exhaustive list of brands that are fast fashion. A brand is fast fashion when it fits into the key elements that I described in my last video. Right now, we are really gonna get into it. What is the problem with the fashion industry? I'm splitting this into two parts because there are so many. I'm going to cover environmental impacts first and then social impacts, but please note that they are very, very, very linked together, and you will see that as I continue. So yeah, that's what I'm going to cover. Let's get into it. So one thing that is a huge problem in the industry is that it is extremely resource intensive, which means it uses very, very large amounts of a range of different resources for a relatively small outcome, meaning that for each item of clothing there's been a lot of resources involved. It's quite hard to find the ins and outs of the manufacturing process in the fashion industry, but on a basic level, there's massive amounts of water used, oil used, chemicals used in the process. Chemicals are used for all sorts of parts of the process, but the ones that I actually know about are dyes to dye fabric, and things like fertilizer, pesticides to grow cotton and other materials used. And then more vaguely, chemicals will be used in the extraction of materials, processing of oil, things like that. Which brings me on to oil. As we probably know, all plastics are made from oil. Like plastic tubs, plastic window frames, everything, pipes, everything is made from oil fundamentally. And plastic comes in many forms, as I've mentioned somewhere in the past. It can be easily manipulated. Synthetic clothing fabrics are made from oil, so they are essentially plastic. This includes materials like polyester, nylon, neoprene, spandex, lycra. As I've mentioned those, I'm just going to mention some materials that are natural: cotton, linen, wool, silk, real silk obviously, and leather. This also brings in the argument of the use for animals. For clothing, that is a whole other conversation. Spoiler alert, it's a bad thing. Many items of clothing are a combination of natural and synthetic materials, so you might see on a top that you have, it might say 60% polyester, 40% cotton, or something like that. This is a whole other problematic issue because it means that if clothing was to be recycled, it would be extremely hard because you'd have to separate these. So in terms of oil used for clothing, it's extremely resource intensive. Synthetic fabrics use almost 342 million barrels of oil per year. Extensive use of oil is bad for many reasons. First of all, oil is obviously a fossil fuel, so it's finite. We don't have an unlimited supply of it, and we need it for other things like energy. But also oil, when mistakes are made, it can be extremely detrimental to the environment in itself, like for example, oil spills or getting into water sources and things like that. So it needs to be managed very carefully, and as you will see, it's not. Then we come on to water. Water is used for many things, again, that I can't specify because it's quite hard to find information on the manufacturing. But one way is to grow the cotton for clothing. Just to put it into perspective, one cotton t-shirt, the amount of water that amount of cotton uses is the equivalent to 3 years worth of one person's drinking water. A pair of denim jeans is the equivalent to 10 years of somebody's drinking water. Actual denim is 100% cotton, but obviously many jeans are mixed with polyester and whatever to make them stretchy. But it just puts it into perspective how much water some types of clothing use. But no matter what type of fabric it is, it uses a lot of resources. I'm going to give more detail on how each of these resources being part of the process has a negative impact later, but water use is a problem because water is becoming increasingly unavailable in the world. Now, obviously, there's always the same amount of water in the world, but with increased water pollution as well, which I will get onto, there's less and less water actually usable in the world. So effectively, it's also a finite resource that will run out. Now, I'm going to throw a statistic in there that I will come back to a few more times in the series. Every year, 100 billion clothing garments are made. Just bear that in mind, particularly in terms of the amount of resources. If one pair of jeans uses 10 years worth of drinking water, then it really does put that into perspective. That's really the definition of unsustainable, only on the first point, and that alone is unsustainable completely. So we've covered resources that get used. Now we're going to cover pollution, i.e. resources that get dashed away. Air pollution, again, is quite hard to find specific things that cause it, but the industry creates a lot of it. The fashion industry as a whole is responsible for 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than shipping and flying combined. So just bear that in mind when the government puts a lot of emphasis on flying being a cause of climate change. There's a lot of other things that are much more damaging that they probably invest in, but that's why they don't want to talk about it. So in terms of how it's caused, it will probably be things like extracting materials like oil if it's a synthetic fibre, processing it to make the synthetic fabrics, manufacturing items, transporting, just any kind of extracting, processing. I mentioned in my last video that supply chains in the fashion industry have got much quicker, but that doesn't mean they're shorter. They're incredibly long in terms of lots of different companies and people and factories and different countries being involved. So every step of the process will be in a different factory, likely in a different country as well. This obviously involves a lot of transportation, and that obviously plays a role in the emissions part as well. Now we get to water pollution, which is where we come back to the resources bit, which mentions oil, chemicals and water. So I mentioned lots of chemicals and dyes are used in the process, many stages of the process, and there's also often excess oil. God knows how that happens, but excess oil, maybe contaminated oil or something. And also the chemicals that are used to help the cotton grow very often get intentionally or unintentionally, usually intentionally, dumped into the nearest water source, which is often a river. And this all ties into what I mentioned in the last video, which was cutting corners, because in order to treat it properly, they would have to spend money on that. So as a result, it gets dumped into rivers. You can only imagine the kind of environmental damage that does. It would contaminate fish, it would contaminate all the wildlife, it would contaminate all the plants, and then when people eat those, they get contaminated. It's very common for villages that live near the factories that are sharing the same water source to them, experience really serious short-term and long-term health problems. They can be anything from neurological diseases to heart problems to liver problems to joint problems to like physical deformities. Is that the word? Not actually just because of water pollution. This can happen because of air pollution as well. And according to the UN, unsafe water kills more people each year than war and all forms of violence combined. And I want to talk about a controversy or a scandal surrounding Pretty Little Thing that happened about maybe 3 years ago, which absolutely boiled my blood. So someone posted on Twitter saying that they never read terms and conditions, but they decided to just this once. They read on Pretty Little Thing's terms and conditions, and I quote, "Some products on our online store may contain chemicals that are known to the state of California to cause cancer and birth defects." As a result of that, there was like a complete uproar online. It was a really big thing. And of course that's bad, and of course that shouldn't be the case at all. But what annoyed me about this was that, where do I even start? Like, there's so many problems with the industry, and yeah, I know a lot of people don't know about them. There's people experiencing liver problems because they live near the factories that you're buying from, and it's like, it's not a newsflash. Like, we know that these companies are damaging. It felt like everyone was surprised that there could be something wrong with a fashion brand, like something bad they're doing. And I was like, this is literally one of the most oppressive industries that exists. And it just was painful to see that either people know about that and they just don't care and they ignore it, or people don't know about any of it and think that this is like, oh my gosh, like, this industry is actually kind of bad. Like, it just, yeah. Another thing you can put into water pollution as well is that, so this is probably the case during production as well, but it's also a big problem with when we have our clothes at home and we wash them. What happens is every wash fabric item sheds little pieces of what we would call like fluff or lint, and it enters the water source because your washing machine is linked to the water source. We call them microfibers. You might have heard of like the term microplastics. It's a type of microplastic. Microfibers, even including things that are so small we can't see, not just like the lint on your clothes, enter that. So a typical wash load is estimated that about 700,000 fibers are shedded and enter the water system. So that's another problem, and I will address what we can do about that in actually my last video of the series. And the last major problem that I'm going to get onto in this video is that the industry is extremely wasteful. Now you're probably thinking, yeah, you said that already. Not just pollution, I mean the actual clothes this time are often the subject of waste, extremely often. And how this happens is because the clothing is made so cheaply in all the high street stores, it's made to be disposable, and the brands know this as well. The reason this happens is because, say you go to Primark and you just need a white top. You go to Primark because you know you'll find cheap ones. You find one for £3, so you buy it. Now, when there's a problem with it, for example, maybe it's shrunk, or maybe it started falling apart, or maybe it's stained, because it's so cheap, you don't feel emotionally attached to it because you don't see it as an investment. It has no meaning to you, so you're more willing to just throw it away, especially if it starts falling apart. This brings me on to a concept called planned obsolescence. Brands design products with an artificially limited life, so they become obsolete over time, which means they produce them cheaply, so they produce them low quality, knowing that they will become unusable over time, very short space of time, and then the customer will come back. This links to the problem of microfibers as well, because cheaply made clothing will shed a lot more easily. So it encourages the customers to come back a lot more frequently, and it leads to a cycle of buying cheap items that you will temporarily use, like as a quick fix, when you've had to dispose of your other item that's just suddenly out of nowhere started falling apart. Even if you haven't disposed of it, even if you just buried it at the bottom of your drawer and you will never wear it again, they want you to come back. So some statistics that demonstrate this is, compared to 20 years ago, we only keep what we buy half as long. There must be something to that. Maybe it means the clothes aren't lasting longer. It could also mean a bunch of other things. The average American throws away 32 kilograms of clothing a year. When I saw that, honestly, I was like, that must be something wrong with that, just because I cannot believe it. And the textile industry roughly occupies 5% of all the world's landfill space, which does not sound like a lot, but it is a lot because the world's big, and something like clothing shouldn't be in a landfill. It's as simple as that. Sending things to landfill is obviously bad. And as I mentioned, in my COVID-19 video, the world is becoming a human landfill and it's overflowing with stuff as a result of our consumption habits. And I mentioned, I think in my first video, about circular economies, linear economies. Circular economy is the goal with fashion, but we are such a long way off. It's extremely linear economy, and as I've explained, because of the fact that we buy things and then throw them away and they just sit in the earth forever and ever, literally ever. But also, even when we try and recycle clothes, unfortunately, it does not just go back into the cycle. So 1% of all clothes that are collected for recycling are actually recycled. 1%. I used to think an example of how the industry was, in a way, a circular economy was the fact that you can return your clothes to clothing stores if you don't like them. But about 2 billion kilograms of waste in the world is generated through clothing returns each year. So there's clearly more to it than that. Something they're not telling us, for example. A lot of times when I've been in the conversation of ethical fashion with people, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, but I donate my clothes to charity. There's a lot of problems I have with that. So number one, let's assume that charity shops always operate the way they should and receive clothes and sell them, and they get sold and then they join the cycle again. That is still not the point, because by buying as many clothes as you always have and just donating them when you don't want them, you're still funding the companies that you're buying from. You're still very much participating in fast fashion because you're always buying new things and not using them for very long. It's not really the point of ethical fashion, donating to charity shops. And then on top of that, you have the fact that it actually doesn't always do what it says on the tin. So 30% of charity shop clothing gets shipped back to the developing world for them to deal with. I assume it's because maybe they're not selling it, or maybe it's not in great condition. So that kind of proves that donating is not as innocent as we think, and by shipping it to other countries, again, it might seem like it's keeping the clothes in the loop, but we don't know what happens with that. The bottom line is it's more, they don't need it. They don't need to deal with our problem, basically. It's not really fair for other countries to receive all this unwanted, often unusable clothing because of our bad habits and our addiction to buying clothes. On that light note, I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video I'm going to talk about the social impacts of the fashion industry, because believe it or not, those were environmental impacts. But anyway, thank you for watching. For all of these videos, I'm going to put in the description resources that you can use to learn more about this problem from people that have number one, probably explained it better than me and not zoned out as much and not said as much, and number two, some of them are like documentaries where people have actually gone and seen and showed you the impacts that the industry is having. So please have a look at those. And I'll say it again as well, if you only have a look at one of them, please watch The True Cost on Netflix, because I always in the back of my mind knew some of the things that was going on, but that was what made me really wake up and be like, well, I'm not supporting this. And I've spoken to a lot of people that have had the same experience. Like, that's been when you really realise how bad it is. Thanks for watching. The next video will also be depressing. The video after that will also be depressing, and the video after that, but the video after that will not be, so that's okay.